Hey everybody, welcome back to New Digs. We're here in Melissa's garden and we're going to plant bulbs. It's a little late in the season.
Yeah, it's early November, but we had such a gorgeous fall that we kind of got fooled and thought we had longer time before the first frost. And I think we mentioned that our first frost was very, very late this year.
It just happened. It was just this week.
Past week, yeah.
So I think we've gotten away with it. We're going to plant some bulbs.
Yep, and these are spring flowering flower bulbs. So they're a perfect project for a beginning gardener. And we'll tell you why, but basically bulbs are super forgiving and you get that wonderful blast of color in the spring, something to look forward to. And fragrant too. So yeah, let's get started. We'll plant some bulbs in my landscape.
Cool.
So I'm here on my front porch, and I mentioned a minute ago that bulbs are great for beginning gardeners because they're perfect little packages. Everything that the spring flowering plant needs to bloom is all packaged up. And I'm going to show you. Bulbs typically come this way. You can buy them mail order, and actually mail order, you're going to get a much better selection. So that if you find yourself really becoming a bulb aficionado down the line, mail order is going to be the way to go. I, however, got these from Ocean State job lots because they're inexpensive, and I just snagged them. And these are called muscari. They're the little grape hyacinths, they're called. They're one of my favorite things when I was a kid. I always thought I wanted to eat them. So when you're planting bulbs, you want to think about a couple of different things. You want to think about when they're going to flower, how tall they're going to get, and if the bulb is fragrant. And if it is, it's a nice thing to put fragrant bulbs where you're going to be able to enjoy them early in the spring. Because remember, not much else is going to be happening when bulbs are blooming in the spring. You also don't want to plant them in a spot that's too wet because bulbs they can rot. But you see this little package, and it's just like if you watched our garlic video, similar idea. You see the root plate on the bottom where the little roots are going to come out. The pointed end is the top, and this one, in fact, even has little baby bulbs. So what happens is, over time, plants like this muscari, grape hyacinth, are going to form these beautiful, fragrant colonies just by reproducing through this little bulb. So let's get started planting. You can see here I have a thyme plant that has kind of died back. I don't know, thyme can be tricky here. I don't know if this is going to come back in the spring, but I'm going to give it a chance to. So I'm just going to trim it back just for tidiness sake. The thing about bulbs, especially these small ones like this, is that you don't want to plant them in rows like little soldiers. You don't want to just, sort of line them up in straight lines. They're a bulb that likes to naturalize. And remember that just means that it's just going to look informal. Some people even will take bulbs like this and just give them a toss and plant them where they land. And I think that's actually a great strategy. So I'm going to get started. When you plant bulbs, one thing, as we said with the garlic video, you want to give them a little squeeze. If they're soft, squishy, mushy, or if they have any mold on them, the bulb will not be viable. So you want them to be firm to the touch. And in general, you want to plant a bulb 2 to 3 times the height of the bulb. Here in the northwest corner, we're probably going to want to plant it deeper. And the reason that you plant bulbs at that depth is because here where we have frost and cold temperatures, the ground heaves and thaws, and bulbs can get heaved out. So here we want to plant them a little bit deeper. So I'm going to plant these 3 times the depth. It's pretty simple. You basically there are actual bulb planters that you can buy, these round things with a handle. I've always just used a trowel, and I'm just going to stick the baby in there. And again, we want to kind of plant them in a natural way. Stick this down, and again, remember, root plate on the bottom. I think they're going to look nice next to this old millstone that I have here. And in the springtime, again, they're going to be fragrant, so I'll get to enjoy that as well. You want to plant fairly large groups of these things. If you just plant, 6 or 8 bulbs, it doesn't make as much of an impact. And you typically want them to be in sort of what would you call it, a drift, I think, to make it look a little more natural. So just kind of plant them where they land, and you're good to go. These, by the way, are going to be there's a lot of information you can find on these bulb packets. This tells me that it should plant in full sun. These are going to be 8 inches tall. They bloom mid-spring. It also tells me how far apart to plant them. I don't pay too much attention to that. I think the main thing they're worried about is crowding. But as I said, I want this to look natural. So there's a lot of great information on bulb packaging that you should read before you get started. So the second bulb that I'm going to be planting today is a daffodil, and this one is called Cheerfulness. And I happen to know, you can see it's a fairly small flowered variety, and there are multiple flowers on each stem, but it's super fragrant. So I definitely wanted to choose a place near the house where I would enjoy the fragrance in the spring. Another classic combination for bulb planting, and especially daffodils, is daylilies, daffodils and daylilies. And the reason is, with bulbs, the one trick is that you have to, after the flower has bloomed in the springtime, you have to leave the foliage in place and until it dies back naturally on its own. And this can be well into June sometimes. The reason is that the leaves, the foliage, is photosynthesizing. And that's what basically is giving the bulb food, the food that it's used up in order to bloom. In the springtime, it's replenishing that so that the bulb is truly perennial and it's going to come back the next year. So you can't cut the foliage off and it's going to look a little bit ratty. There's no getting around it. So it's good to plant it with daylilies because the daffodil foliage is similar to daylily foliage and it will just kind of blend in. So that's a great combination, daffodils and daylilies. So I'm just looking and getting some information here from the bulb packaging. And indeed, these are easy, satisfying, and fun. So it says it right there. Okay, so this says that these should be planted full sun to partial sun. They're going to get 16 inches tall and they bloom in late spring. So this is going to be a perfect spot. You can see the daffodil bulb is larger, and basically the size of the bulb corresponds to the size of the flower. So daffodil bulbs are going to be bigger than the muscari bulbs because the plant is that much bigger. You can see this one has a baby that's coming. You can see the roots really clearly, top really clearly. So again, I'm going to try to get this 3 times the height of the daffodil. So this can also affect where you're going to plant, because if you're trying to compete with tree roots, sometimes you may not be able to get something like this 3 inches down. Not 3 inches, sorry, 3 times the height down. So in we go. Now, oftentimes, when you plant bulbs, you feed them at the same time. There's a product, it's an organic product called Bulb Tone that I usually use. I couldn't get my hands on any. But this first year, again, the bulb has everything it needs, so the food isn't really necessary. But in future years, if you want to keep the colony going, it doesn't hurt to put a little bit of granular fertilizer. They also say that when the bulbs first emerge in spring, you can give them a little top dressing of that as well. Bone meal is another product, organic product that people sometimes use. The problem with bone meal is that if you have a dog, not surprisingly, the dog will come and dig up all of your hard work because he thinks it's a bone. So this third bulb that I'm going to be planting today is called Cilla Siberica. And you may have seen in, they say here, early spring, you may have seen by the roadside, especially by old farmhouses, banks of these things. They're just this gorgeous gentian blue, and they form a carpet. They're absolutely stunning, and bees apparently love them. Jill was telling me that when bees collect the pollen from these, the pollen's actually blue. And when you collect the honeycomb that the bees have made, you can see where the pollen from these Cilla is in the honeycomb. So I think that's an amazing fact. I can't wait. But these are great for naturalizing. And again, that just means you want to plant them in a swath, and you want to plant them in a place where they can just go crazy. These things are famous for popping up in your lawn because the squirrels and chipmunks, and that is one thing I should mention, is that bulbs occasionally will be dug up by critters and moved. So if in the spring you find a daffodil blooming in some random place that you don't remember planting it, you're not losing your mind. It almost certainly was some sort of critter who thought that would be a good place to stash it. So these will pop up in the lawn. So I want to put them in a place where they can just kind of go to town, and they're not going to interfere with anything else that I'm planting. So this is a bed that was here when I bought the house, my new digs. And I haven't really done anything with it yet. It's a daylily bed. And what I should do, at some point is dig these up, divide them, feed them. I just haven't had a chance. So what I think I'm going to do in the short term is start to think about naturalizing Cilla down this bed. I think this will also look nice right on this little corner here of my split rail fence. And you see here too, I've got some pots of oregano. These were, I brought them home from my nursery. We were getting ready to dump them for the season. Oregano is perennial. And I think if I put the oregano here, it's going to soften out the edge of this bed. And the Cilla, I think, will look darling interplanted with it. And by the time the Cilla is ready to die back, the oregano will be coming up and it'll hide some of that foliage as it's dying back. So these are tiny little bulbs. And they are going to get a height of maybe 4 inches. Yeah, they say 4 to 8 inches. 4 is much more likely. And they are an early spring plant. So it's something fun. It's one of the first things, aside from snowdrops, which we're going to talk about in a second. It's one of the earliest things to bloom in the garden, along with crocus. So let's take a look at these things. So these are just super cute, tiny little bulbs. And I can picture a squirrel, holding it with delight and imagining where in the landscape he's gonna move it and plant it. So again, 2 to 3 times the depth, the height of the thing. That's how deep we're going to plant it. Root plate in the bottom, this on the top. And you can see too, sometimes bulbs will have started to sprout already, and that's okay. Ideally, we want to get them in the ground before that happens. It can happen if they're kept in a warm environment. But in general, unless, it feels rotty, it's okay to plant. I think I'll plant the oregano first, just so that I kind of know where that's going to be. My bet is that this is pretty root bound. Yep. And if you remember, this is the kamikaze gardening where we just rip the bottom off this because we want those roots to be able to have maximum contact with the soil. Oregano is a tough plant. You're not going to do anything to it by ripping it. So let's get that in there. And you notice we have, as I said, we've had our first frost, but luckily the soil is not frozen yet. And that's the only key when it comes to planting bulbs. I've planted bulbs in December before, believe it or not. You can plant bulbs as long as the soil can be worked, as long as it's not completely frozen. And just an aside, the reason that we plant bulbs in the fall is because they need a period of cold. They need to be chilled in order to produce that flower. So if you live somewhere in a climate that does not get a cold winter, and you're going to grow bulbs, you actually have to give them an artificial period of cold in order to induce flowering. So I've got our oregano stuck in. I'm going to do the same here, make this little edge, and I'm just going to poke these around it. These you can plant super close together too. And again, the smaller the bulb, the better it is if you pack them kind of tightly, because it'll make more of an impact. I'm actually really excited to see what this little corner is going to look like in the spring. Right back here, I have an Ito peony, which is it's a big, glorious tree peony type blossom. So this was its first year. It did blossom, but next year I think this is going to be a really pretty little corner. So the last spring flowering bulb that we're going to plant today is the Snowdrop. And this particular one it's called a giant snowdrop. There are a couple of different forms. There's a double form, and then there's the really tiny ones that are probably the first bulb to bloom in the spring. I was hoping to get my hands on some of those. I was too late, missed out, but I did get the giant ones. And these are gonna be, I think it says about 16 inches tall. So it's a good sized plant. And I'm gonna be naturalizing them back here. They don't have a ton of fragrance. So it's not necessarily, a consideration that I want to get them near the entrance where I can smell them. But I just think they're going to look really pretty naturalized. There are lots of herbs in here. So I think the white with the herbs is going to look really beautiful. So these are the giant snowdrops. I've not grown them before, really excited. So you may have noticed that we were not planting tulips today. And they're such a staple of many people's thoughts of spring. But here in the northwest corner, there are a couple of problems with tulips. One is deer. Daffodils and all the other things that I planted today are deer resistant, meaning the deer don't go after them. Tulips are one of their top 10 favorite things. So if they don't get mown down by the deer, the other issue is that they're not reliably perennial here. Most people treat tulips almost like an annual plant, one that you plant for one season. If it happens to come back the next year, that's great. But chances are, if it does, it's going to come back in a significantly smaller size bloom and may not come back at all. So tulips are just not something we tend to, I at least here in the northwest corner, tend to plant unless I do them in containers. And they can be absolutely stunning in containers. But that's, for me, I like to stick with the things that are a little more reliable and cold hardy and deer resistant. Well, guys, thanks again for joining us here in my garden. And we just planted 4 types of bulbs today, but there are a million bulbs out there.
Yeah, if you think ahead and get some catalogs, you can just spend hours perusing the catalogs. I mean, the alliums alone could go on for pages.
Globes, yeah. And we didn't really talk about daffodils. That's one type of the big classic cup form. The yellow ones came.
There's hundreds and hundreds of types of daffodils, and there's also a bulb for pretty much every kind of soil condition or lighting condition.
Yeah.
There's a lot of woodland bulbs that can take some shade. There's a lot of there's some bulbs that can take a little bit of damp, that actually prefer a little damp.
Yeah.
So it's a big topic. So
right.
So this is what we got done today. So
yeah, and I just wanted to mention too that if you're interested in horticultural history, bulbs, especially tulips, have quite an interesting story. They were a commodity, and we think that a lot of bulbs started making their way from the Middle East into Europe during the Crusades. Because they were highly prized, and tulips in particular. I think there's a whole thing about these insanely expensive tulip
the tulips
bulbs.
had a big kind of a bubble, a financial tulip bubble, and then a bust that went with it. So
and they made and broke people's fortunes. There's actually a book just about that. Tulipia, I think it's called. I have it upstairs. So winter reading, everybody. So again, thanks for joining us, and hope that you learned something.
So we'll see you next time on New Digs.
Bye.